I've been thinking about making this video for almost a year now, but I knew it would be my most ambitious video to date and I wasn't up to it until recently. I've been messing around in Shotcut, the video editor that Taryn introduced me to, and I just recently figured out how to do a multi-track recording by having both an audio track and a video track running at the same time despite being recorded at different times. I do want to make more professional videos, and I've also done so much research on typing history, and I realize there are a lot of people who would rather receive it in this form than in book form, so I thought I'd try this out. In this video I will profile the best typists from each decade since the beginning of typing competitions in the 1880s, a total of 14 typists in all. For the most part, most of these typists were only on top for a handful of years, so it was pretty obvious what decade to choose for each. But there were some typists who had an arguable claim at being the best typist in multiple decades. I decided to arrange them in such a way that I would have one unique typist for every single decade, and I also tried to list each typist only in the decade where they had their greatest success, although in a couple decades I had to fudge a little, because some decades like the 1970s and 1980s had more big-name typists than other decades like the 1960s and 1990s. I acknowledge that my 60s pick would be better for the 70s and my 90s pick would be better for the 80s, but I felt all these typists certainly deserved to be mentioned regardless, so I moved them around a little. Christopher Latham Schulz's Remington typewriter was first mass-produced in 1874, but it didn't sell much in its first few years, primarily because it was released during one of the worst depressions in American history. However, the typewriter industry really began to take off in the 1880s once the calligraph typewriter was introduced in 1881, providing competition for the Remington. Remington's typewriter was always more popular than calligraph's, but both typewriters sold better when there was competition than they did when Remington held a monopoly. Shortly thereafter, many other typewriter brands joined the market, and people became interested in which machines were the fastest. By the late 1880s, typing competitions began to emerge for just this reason. Although it was not the first typing competition ever held, the first typing competition to get significant media attention came in July 1888 in Cincinnati, where Frank McGorran of Salt Lake City used a Remington typewriter with a QWERTY layout, while Louis Traub of Cincinnati used a calligraph which had a wildly different layout with 52 separate keys for all uppercase and lowercase letters. McGorran won easily because he taught himself to touch type, while 52 keys was a bit too much for Traub to memorize. McGorran won $500, equivalent to over $10,000 in today's money. Not long afterwards, single keyboards became standard over double keyboards, and QWERTY became the standard keyboard layout, but that actually had much more to do with business transactions than performance in competition. You'll often read things, even on Wikipedia, that claim that McGorran invented touch typing, but that is absolutely false. Schulz's typewriter arguably wasn't even the first typewriter, as there were many previous typewriter prototypes that were unsuccessful, including machines that were designed for the blind to write. That being the case, the first touch typist was probably a blind person using one of those earlier typewriter models that have since been forgotten. Having said that, McGorran was certainly an important popularizer of touch typing, and in his wake, typists definitely realized that they wouldn't be able to win competitions unless they learned touch typing. McGorran did not use the home row method, as like me he occasionally used different fingers to type the same letters, but in my opinion he didn't do it enough. Home row wasn't even really invented until the late 1890s. McGorran's dominance was short-lived, but he remains fondly remembered today. The top typist of the 1890s was Frank's younger brother Charles, who went on to dominate the typing scene for a far longer period of time than Frank himself did. However, because Frank's win was a much bigger deal historically than any of Charles's accomplishments, Charles has tended to be forgotten by history, but I was still able to find a fair amount of information on him in my research. In January 1892, he broke Frank's 1-minute record of 125 words per minute from unseen text by typing 128 words per minute. 4 months later, he became the first typist to register a speed of over 200 words per minute, repeating the sentence, "Now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of the party," which was the crick-brown frocks of its day. However, in the first half-century of typing, words per minute were defined based on actual words, and the definition of a word would not change to 5 characters until 1924, so all the typing speeds from this era are inflated. While using a Fay Schulz typewriter, a typewriter invented by Christopher Latham Schulz's youngest son Zalman that had nothing to do with the typewriter that Remington bought from Schulz to begin with, Charles McGorran set his all-time record of 212 words per minute, and he would remain generally regarded as the best typist throughout the 1890s until the little-known teenager John A. Shields broke his record in 1904. In the 1890s and early 1900s, there were few organized typing contests, as most of the top typists gave solitary exhibitions, but in the late 1900s that would change. In the early 1900s, there was an increasing demand for the development of an organized competitive typing scene, and a formal circuit of competitions was introduced in the middle of that decade. The international contests were held every year at the National Business Show in New York, the largest business convention in the world, which was regularly held in the most prestigious New York venues, including Madison Square Garden and even once in Carnegie Hall. Typewriter manufacturers were major players at these events and helped drum up business for themselves by introducing typing contests and eventually training typists to compete in them. Neither the McGorran brothers nor John A. Shields ever competed in these events, so the early championships consisted of a new breed of competitors. Typists at the International Professional Typewriter Championship typed for an hour, and speeds were determined based on the number of words correctly typed minus 5 times the number of errors made. This was later changed to 10 times the number of errors in 1918. A few years later, a farm team or feeder system was developed for younger typists. Amateurs typed for 30 minutes and novices typed for 15 minutes, which was eventually raised to 20 minutes. Novices and amateurs rose up the ladder to compete with the professionals, who got to go on glamorous and luxurious nationwide tours. Rose Fritz, a teenage girl from Providence, Rhode Island, won the first professional championship in 1906 and followed that up by winning each of the next 3 championships in succession. Fritz first competed in 1905 in 1 hour and half-hour blindfolded competitions, finishing second in both, although the blindfolded competitions were quickly dropped after the competitions based on typing text. Paul Munter, the man who beat Fritz in the half-hour competition, typed more words in 1906 on his Remington than Fritz did, but he only finished in 5th place because he was wildly inaccurate, while Fritz won on accuracy on her Underwood. Clearly the fact that she could see what she was typing while Munter could not significantly helped her. Although Remington would quickly develop a model using Underwood's technology, they would never again overtake Underwood in the marketplace or in competition, and Underwood went on to win every single professional typing championship through 1930. Fritz was one of the first typists to go on a lavish international tour. She had won 30 typing competitions by the time she was 23 years old in 1911. In 1908, she met the Prince and Princess of Wales, who became King George V and Queen Mary of Teck. She spoke to crowds of over 1,000 people, and it was reported that she could write from 130 to 140 words per minute, and at the same time add up a column of 6 or 7 numbers of 6 figures each, and not make a single mistake in either the writing or the figures. Competitive typing contests were pioneering in that they were among the first endeavors where women could compete on the same playing field with men, and in the early years they usually won at a time when they still weren't able to vote. The 1910s were a tremendously competitive decade across all typing competitions, as there were 6 different professional champions that decade, but Margaret Owen managed to stand out from the pack in a big way by winning 4 professional typing championships in 1913, 1915, 1916, and 1917, in a decade when only one other typist won more than once. Owen debuted as a professional in 1912 despite still being at the amateur level. The National Business Show offered a massive prize of $1,000 to any amateur typist who managed to beat the 1911 professional champion H.O. Blaisdell's championship-winning score of 112 words per minute from the previous year. Owen managed to collect this prize, equivalent to over $28,000 in today's dollars, by averaging 114 words per minute over an entire hour, although that year she only finished 3rd. However, she was improving so quickly relative to her peers that she clearly overtook them by the next year, and she was greatly aided by the fact that the 1912 champion Florence Wilson abruptly retired after her championship. Owen went on a run of 4 championships in 5 years, although she lost the 1918 championship to George Hosfield. That year's competition did also have a 1-minute contest for typists to test their burst typing ability. The idea of burst typing only over the time span of 2 or 3 seconds like we do it today would have absolutely blown their minds. In that event, Owen averaged 170 words per minute over an entire minute without making an error, setting a Guinness record that would last for decades, well after her death. Owen frequently endorsed women's rights in print at a time when she was still unable to vote, but what I find most notable about her is that she wrote The Secret of Typewriting Speed, which was later released as the Typist Vademecum. Of all the typing books I read and or skimmed through while researching my own, hers is by far the most entertaining typing book I've ever seen. You can find it on Google Books. Here are some funny gems from it. It is now 2 weeks before the event of the year. No matter how accustomed we have become to staying up late, dancing, skating, theater parties, or any of the other mild dissipations of which we are all so fond, for these 2 weeks we will be in bed at 9 o'clock. Mother used to dose me up with a nerve tonic, but now I find that the only tonic I need is plenty of sleep. Get slept out, in other words. Then there is something else that I have never before breathed to a soul. I say to myself over and over, dozens of times a day, I am going to win! With the first row of letters, it is impossible to make a sentence, for it does not contain a vowel. We will have to overcome this difficulty by straight practice work. Just pretend you are writing some name that you have found in the muster roll of the Russian army. You may have noticed that the girl whose machine demands the most attention from the repairman is the one who scarcely knows a platen from a way rod, and incidentally it is she who always lays all the blame for any deficiency in her work on the poor inanimate typewriter that if it could only talk would have a deplorable tale of neglect to relate. Most of the young people of America are not what could be called readers. Honestly, I disagree with that one, because I think a social life is probably more important than reading ultimately, even though I wouldn't have said that a few years ago, probably. But you see her writing style, it's warm and friendly and fun, even if she can be condescending a few times like that one. So I really recommend this book. The 1920s and 1930s typing scene was dominated by two typists, George Hosfield and Albert Tangora, who surprisingly both hailed from the same hometown of Paterson, New Jersey. Hosfield was 5 years older than Tangora and got a big head start as a result. Both typists won their first professional championships at the age of 20, Hosfield in 1918 and Tangora in 1923. Together they won every single championship from 1920 to 1937. After Tangora came of age, he had consistently more raw speed than Hosfield did, but Hosfield invariably had better accuracy, which was enough to swing a lot of typing championships in his favor. They were the most successful champions in the history of the International Typewriting Championship and in the mechanical typewriter era in general, with Hosfield winning 10 championships to Tangora's 7. They were very evenly matched and frequently finished within a couple words per minute of each other in the championship, sometimes even less than 1 word per minute. Sometimes one typist would be faster in practice and the other would win the main event. They were extremely evenly matched. However, I decided Hosfield was clearly the better typist in the 20s, while Tangora was clearly the better typist in the 30s. Both typists were born in America but were the children of immigrants. Hosfield's ancestors came from Germany while Tangora's came from Italy. Hosfield's original first name was actually Hosfeld, H-O-S-F-E-L-D, but he changed it to make it sound more English to protest German aggression during World War I. Hosfield set the all-time novice record in 1914 and the all-time amateur record in 1917. The latter record would never be broken until the introduction of electric typewriters in the competitions in the 40s. Hosfield actually posted a faster average speed in the amateur class that year, over a half hour, than Owen did in the professional class, over an hour. So clearly he would be a man to be reckoned with once he went pro. The following year, in 1918, Hosfield won the professional championship as a rookie, becoming the first ever typist to do so, between Rose Fritz in 1906 and Margaret Hama in 1941. He then went on to win 3 championships in a row from 1920 to 22, along with the 1926, 27, 29, and 30 championships before there was a hiatus during the Great Depression. Even though Hosfield won more championships and likely demonstrated in front of more students, although it was estimated that both Hosfield and Tangora exhibited in front of multiple hundreds of thousands of students over many years. Tangora was the bigger star because Hosfield had a quieter and more reticent personality and seemed less inclined to draw attention to himself. He was more serious, while Tangora and especially Cortez Peters were more entertaining. Hosfield primarily performed at schools and colleges, but occasionally also demonstrated at newspaper offices, Lions clubs, Kiwanis clubs, and radio shows, as did Tangora. While on tour, Hosfield would type both previously seen and unseen material repeatedly for a half a minute or a full minute, type text backwards, and type each line at an increasing rate of speed to demonstrate the difference between 20, 40, 60 words per minute, and so on. Typists in this era could feel the speed of their typing with the accuracy of a metronome. I surely can't do that. Although Hosfield was arguably the more successful, Tangora was almost certainly the more exciting of the two. He moved up the typing ladder much more quickly than Hosfield did, winning the novice championship in 1917, winning the amateur championship in 1919, and debuting as a professional in 1920 at the age of 17. However, it took a few years for him to build up his speed and accuracy to compete with Hosfield. Just like Hosfield, he won his first championship at the age of 20 in 1923, and then made it 3 in a row by also winning in 24 and 25, but Hosfield slightly beat him 4 of the next 5 years, with Tangora's only additional victory coming in 1928. Like Rose Fritz, he liked to answer arithmetic problems while typing, eventually summing lists of figures 5 numbers wide and 6 deep while typing without making an error during exhibitions. That landed him a spot in a Ripley's Believe It or Not cartoon, which was not the only comic strip he appeared in. Tangora was quite the celebrity in his day, as he taught Prince Nicholas of Romania how to use a typewriter, and he was the first person invited to speak at the Florida House of Representatives chamber in Tallahassee when it opened in 1923. One time he took a cross-country trip in a Packard automobile on a honeymoon with his first wife, Dorothy Lane, and he literally typed in the car. Probably no one in history took typing contests as seriously as Tangora did. He once insured his hands for $100,000 like concert pianists do. He told the Minneapolis Star, "I sleep 11 hours a night, punch a typewriter 3 hours a day, and put in a few hours beating a punching bag. He once fasted 2 days before a contest while getting a deep rub down and massage by his athletic trainer. It boggles my mind that the typists of that era even had athletic trainers. After the 1927 contest, the International Typing Championships left New York and began to rotate to other venues in Sacramento, Toronto, and Richmond. Unfortunately, at that same time, the Depression struck, so they were unable to find venues for the typing contest from 1931 to 1934, and the typewriter companies, Underwood in particular, no longer wanted to fund them. Both Hosfield and Tangora did okay in the Depression themselves, as they were both well known and they continued to tour, although in those years they tended to tour regionally in big city department stores rather than going on the lavish international tours of the 20s. Underwood cut Tangora's salary from $10,000 to $5,000 a year at about this point, according to Tangora's son Martin. Martin's still alive, and I interviewed him for the book, and he had a lot of good information on Tangora. Tangora at that moment decided to defect from Underwood and use a Royal typewriter instead because Royal gave him a better deal. Unexpectedly, this led to a revival in the typing contest because Royal wanted to fund them to take Underwood on now that they had Tangora. In 1935, the championships returned and had a new permanent venue at Chicago's now-defunct Hotel Sherman. Tangora won, ending Underwood's streak of 25 consecutive championships. Underwood, in response, kind of had a hissy fit and withdrew all its typists from the 1936 and 1937 championships, instead staging a rival championship in Toronto. Tangora and Hosfield would never compete against each other again, but Tangora won both Chicago contests and Hosfield won both Toronto contests before retiring. Tangora made one final appearance in 1941, but lost to Margaret Hama, who used a more advanced electric typewriter. Tangora then served in World War II, after which he retired from typing and opened a typewriter repair and sales shop in the Chicago suburb of Evanston, where he raised his 2 sons. Stella Pedronas marked a significant changing of the guard in the typing world, as she was the last typist to win an international typewriting championship before the contest folded in 1946. Typing championships were clearly at their most prominent in the 1910s and 1920s. Between the hiatus during the Depression, the schism between the Chicago and Toronto contests, and World War II, when the contests were shut down along with most industrial production, they never really regained their momentum from the first quarter century of the 20th century and slowly declined from there. There wasn't even a professional championship in the years 1939 and 1940 because Hosfield retired and Tangora sat those years out, but there was a bit of a revitalization after that, as IBM had recently purchased an electric typewriter from the Electromatic Company in 1933, and they decided to enter it in competition in 1940. They trained a number of typists, but the 2 main ones were Margaret Hama and Stella Pedronas. Hama set the all-time 1-hour record on an electric typewriter in 1941 with an average speed of 149 words per minute. Tangora also set the 1-hour record on a mechanical typewriter with a speed of 142 words per minute, but he was just technologically outmatched at that point. Pedronas was significantly slower that year, averaging only 123 words per minute over 20 minutes to finish 3rd in the novice class. However, she was intensely motivated during World War II. While the men were off at war, she rapidly improved, probably in part because she had a gig where IBM arranged for her to type letters to soldiers for the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle. By the time the final contest was held in 1946, she was technically eligible to enter the professional, amateur, and novice championships all in the same year, since she had failed to win the novice championship in 1941. She won them all, narrowly nosing out Hama in the professional class with a win of 142 words per minute to 140, even though Pedronas did not match Hama's record from 1941. Additionally, in the 1920s, they had begun holding a separate championship for women in response to Tangora and Hosfield's dominance, and Pedronas won that too, becoming the only typist to win all 4 championships in the same year. Also in 1946, Pedronas set the all-time 1-minute record on an electric typewriter by typing 216 words per minute, a record that would remain on the book for decades and would not be broken until at least the 70s. IBM had no interest in funding the contest after that, as Underwood had done, since IBM felt they had already proven their point, and they kind of fizzled out, and before long almost everyone forgot that typing contests even existed, with a few mere mentions in the Guinness Book the only evidence for them. Pedronas withdrew into private life, mostly serving as a stay-at-home mom after she married Alton Garnand, the son of a man who owned a hotel and furniture store in Garden City, Kansas. She made appearances for IBM occasionally prior to that, but nowhere near as often as Tangora and Hosfield toured. Sadly, she became stricken with multiple sclerosis in the 60s, and for some time she was unable to type. IBM quietly dropped her from their stable, but she did bounce back, regained many of her earlier capabilities, and lived all the way until the late 2000s, far longer than most of the other typing greats lived, with the exception of Barbara Blackburn, who both was born and died at around the same time as Pedronas. Cortez Peters was the first major African-American typing star. He came of age during the 20s, which might have been the most racist decade in American history after the Civil War ended. He won the amateur typing championship in 1925, exactly halfway between 1896, when the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson institutionalized segregation, and 1954, when the court overturned it in Brown v. Board of Education. By the time Peters started competing, the Underwood Typewriter Company pretty much had a monopoly on the competition to such a degree that no other typewriter brand would dare to compete against them in these competitions. Underwood itself was a very bigoted corporation with a long history of racism and sexism. They even had Nazi connections that I uncovered in my research. Despite his typing successes, Peters was never mentioned in newspapers like all the white typists were, and he wasn't initially able to go on the lavish tours that they were either. While he wasn't usually as fast as George Hosfield and Albert Tangore in his heyday, and he never beat Tangore in competition, other typists like Barney Stapert, who were similar in speed to Peters, were allowed to go on tours. But Peters got the last laugh, as when the International Typing Contest was revived in 1935, he beat all the Underwood typists, including Hosfield, finishing second only behind Tangora, successfully integrating competitive typing 11 years before Jackie Robinson did for Major League Baseball. At that point, Peters was in demand for exhibitions, and he joined Tangora in the Royal Camp and did finally get the opportunity to go on tours. He was probably the greatest showman in typing history, as while most of the other typists did extremely nerdy things like answering math problems or reciting state capitals while typing. No, I am not kidding. Peters gave the crowd something akin to a vaudeville show. He was the first competitive typist I know of who played his typewriter like a musical instrument. He once typed 184 words per minute outdoors in sub-zero weather, which won him a shout-out in Ripley's Believe It or Not comic strip. In the 50s, he wrote a play called The Typewriter and I, spoofing The King and I, where his typewriter was put on trial for speeding, and he made numerous appearances on radio shows. Most importantly, he also started a chain of 3 business schools in the mid-30s in Washington, Baltimore, and Chicago to train inner-city black youth in a variety of secretarial and business tasks, including typing. He is probably one of the most forgotten pioneers in African American history. If you ask me who I thought the greatest typist of all time was, I wouldn't pick myself, but rather Cortez Peters Jr., the son of the previous typist discussed. After Peters Sr. failed to win a professional typewriter championship, he pushed his son hard to complete the family destiny. Unfortunately, the International Typewriter Championship was no longer held after Pedronas' victory in 1946, so Peters' training was initially all for naught. However, he did take over his father's business school upon Peters Sr.'s too early death from a heart attack in 1964. Unfortunately, the Peters schools collapsed not long afterward, as in the wake of Martin Luther King's assassination, there were widespread riots in Washington, especially in the same neighborhood where the main Peters campus was located. The campus was forced to move several times, many parents withdrew their children from school, and the schools quickly lost 2/3 of their students and eventually their accreditation. Both the Washington and Baltimore campuses closed in the mid-70s, while the largely autonomous Chicago school struggled on by itself into the 90s. However, Peters himself became a wild success late in life. In 1976, he typed 225 words per minute over a single minute on an electric typewriter to break Stella Pedronas' 30-year-old record, but for some reason never submitted it to Guinness. Years later, he was recorded typing 297 words per minute at a Xerox exhibition, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported that he typed so fast the machine switched to its memory mode to catch up with his fleetness of fingers. I've got to figure he was only typing for a few seconds though, and not an entire minute. In 1979, Peters released a typing guide that was used as the default for several states for many years, and he was the last typist to make a living going on nationwide tours. Unlike earlier typists, he primarily demonstrated to typing teachers rather than typing students, but his seminars were wildly popular and they were booked 2 years in advance. He was so committed that he continued touring even after a blood vessel in his left eye broke, which made it difficult for him to see, and he died while on a tour stop in 1993 in Missouri. No major typist after him would make a living wage solely as a typing demonstrator. Ron Mingo was probably the most well-rounded great typist in history, as he managed to successfully juggle a pro-athletic career, chasing typing records, and a career as a typing teacher, baseball coach, and motivational speaker, all simultaneously. Born in Mississippi in the Jim Crow period, he managed to escape to Los Angeles as a boy, where he played for John C. Fremont High School's city championship-winning baseball squad alongside 3 future Major League players in 1963. The team was all minority with 15 black players and 1 Latino player, which made a statement in an era when the Civil Rights Act had not yet been passed. Mingo eventually signed development deals with the California Angels and the Houston Astros, but never quite made the majors, perhaps because he couldn't decide whether baseball or typing was his first love. By 1965, at age 18, he set Los Angeles City College's all-time record of 140 words per minute, but refused numerous secretarial offers to focus focus on his baseball career. But he was also truly obsessed with typing, as he used his downtime before games looking for typewriter repair shops to practice typing, rather than socializing with his teammates. In an era when almost everybody was now using electric typewriters, Mingo preferred mechanical ones. In the 70s, he decided he wanted to challenge Margaret Owen's 1-minute Guinness record of 170 words per minute on a mechanical typewriter. He once spent $3,000 to adjust his typewriter to make it amenable for faster speeds, and at one point spent 6 or 7 hours a day practicing to break Owen's record. Sadly, he was never certified for it, as his highest listed record was 166 words per minute. From the 70s onward, after his baseball career fizzled out, he served as a baseball coach and typing instructor in Oakland, most famously as MC Hammer's baseball coach. He made many regional TV appearances and a few national ones, most notably appearing on Flip Wilson's very popular variety show, where he typed to Santana's Evil Ways and Stevie Wonder's Higher Ground. He is arguably the most inspiring of all the great typists. Barbara Blackburn was probably the most famous typist of the second half of the 20th century, primarily because she was featured more prominently on television than any other typist in the era when television dominated the cultural landscape like no other. She is best known as the only legendary American typist who preferred the Dvorak keyboard to the QWERTY. In 1975, she was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for typing 150 words per minute over a 15-minute period and 212 words per minute over shorter periods. Since most of the other Guinness record holders like Tangora, Owen, and Pajunas had long since retired or died, she was considered the current record holder by most people in the tail end of the 20th century, although personally I think both Cortez Peters Jr. and Ron Mingo were faster than her. While her records are well known, how she initially obtained them was not until I discovered a St. Louis Post-Dispatch article from 1977 stating that she got listed in Guinness because, and I quote, "a Dvorak advocate who has exclusive rights to the keyboard wrote a letter to the editors describing her skills." Clearly the record verification process was nowhere near as stringent back then as it is today.
That was easy.
You can probably justifiably argue that this was pretty much a Dvorak marketing scheme when you consider that Blackburn's choice of keyboard layout was always mentioned, and the Guinness Book never mentioned that all the other record holders used QWERTY, but regardless, I still think she was probably one of the top typists of her time. In the mid-80s, she was a consultant for MasterType, the most popular typing game of that era before Mavis Beacon came out. She also filmed an ad for Apple before most famously appearing on an early episode of Late Night with David Letterman. On that occasion, she forgot to insert paper on her first attempt, and she shifted her right hand one column to the right on her second attempt, which made her typing look like gobbledygook. Letterman then made brutal fun of her on the air, as you have likely seen. She was so disgusted by the spectacle that she considered suing Letterman before ultimately withdrawing to private life and her job as a secretary for State Farm in Salem, Oregon. Regardless, considering what a laughingstock I became in YouTube comment sections 30 years later, I definitely have a lot of sympathy for her. Gabriele Monath is the most obscure of all typists in this video. In the 80s and 90s, she was wildly successful on the intersteno scene as she won the typewriter championship at 6 consecutive intersteno congresses from 1981 to 1993. What she did was harder than what anyone is doing today because the championships she entered did not allow typists to correct their errors, meaning she was arguably the last great typing champion who needed to stress accuracy more than speed. Monath clearly wanted to remain anonymous because she was the only typist for whom I was unable to find a picture, and also the only typist I was unable to find birth and or death dates for. However, I did find a picture of the IBM Selectric typewriter that she used, which was painted in the colors of the flag of her German homeland. Like most Germans, she used the Querz keyboard, which keeps all the QWERTY letters in place except for the Z and Y, which are inverted. Her period of dominance was so lengthy that when she started out, she technically hailed from West Germany at first, but Germany reunited during her typing prime. I did a deep dive researching her for the intersteno chapter of my book, but it mostly came out empty-handed. She wasn't even mentioned in the 125 years of intersteno history that I own, and she has since fallen off the radar. I can hardly blame her though, because given my druthers, I probably wouldn't have wanted to become a public figure myself. The Czech typist Helena Matuskova is widely considered the greatest intersteno champion of all time. She initially started out as a protege of Jaroslav Zabiacic, a former typing champion who became the most celebrated typing teacher in Czech history. Together, Zabiacic and Matuskova started the very successful Zav School for training Czech typists, and after Matuskova retired as a typist, they eventually got married. From 1998 to 2005, Matuskova won the World Championship in intersteno's main event all 4 times, and she set an all-time record by typing 955 characters per minute or 191 words per minute in Czech over a 30-minute time interval. Shortly before she came to prominence, intersteno had just switched from using almost exclusively typewriters in 1993 to primarily computers in 1995. Soon thereafter, all competitors at intersteno's live events would use Microsoft Word to compete. Since Word obviously contains the capability for macros and autocorrect features, that opened the door for typists to use macros to more efficiently enter text. Although some people might argue this is not typing, Intersteno technically bills its World Championship as a text production championship and not a typing championship, so they decided to allow these techniques. The Czech typists like Matuskova capitalized. Although by the end of the decade, online typing competitions were beginning to rapidly gain popularity, the Intersteno scene was still probably at that point a bigger deal, and I think I'm more impressed with what Matuskova did than any of the online typists. Much to my horror and chagrin, I became the first typing celebrity of the social media age. After emerging as a relatively early pioneer in the online competitive typing arena in 2008 and 2009, I came to prominence upon winning the Ultimate Typing Championship at the South by Southwest Interactive Conference, which was memorably immortalized in 2 semi-viral YouTube videos that you have likely seen. The UTC was my first of 19 typing championships from 2010 to 2021. These included a record 7 Intersteno Mother Tongue Championships, 3 Intersteno Multilingual Championships, 3 Type Racer Championships, and 2 Typing Zone Championships. In 2011, I became the only typist to win the Intersteno Mother Tongue and Multilingual Championships in the same year. I also held the English language record on pretty much every online competitive typing site at some point that decade, and became the only typist to simultaneously hold the all-time records on all 3 of the then most popular typing sites, 10 Fast Fingers, Type Racer, and Nitro Type. My era lasted pretty much the entire decade, as I did not begin to be overtaken until 2019, when Shaq upset me to win the clicking championship. We were about evenly matched for the next year until he clearly overtook me as the 2020s commenced. Obviously, we don't necessarily know yet who the best typist of the 2020s will be. It seems most likely that it will be Shaq or Josh. Right now I'm guessing Josh just because he cares more. But since the decade so far has still barely started, it's possible there is some typist most of us haven't even heard of yet who will dominate the second half of the decade, overtaking both of them. But I thought I would finally share the fruits of my research with you, since I know that a 500-page book will probably be a bit too much for many people's attention spans, while a video like this makes it more digestible. I also wanted to try to teach myself how to make serious professional videos because I would like to see if I can potentially grow my channel to a degree that I could live on it. I know the Maladroit Millennial videos were a bust, and I'm probably done making those, but I do think I want to make more historical typing videos, and pretty soon I will finally get around to making instructional typing videos like you all probably want more than anything else. And maybe I'd like to try out making some auto racing videos someday because I can see some potential there as well. Thank you, and good night.